Hello, ghouls. I'm back. I had a bit of a week off. We did one vampire story, but I didn't get another one done. I'm sorry. This class this week is going to be on the dream and how it's represented in that early British Gothic period again. You know me, I'm consistent. I'm going to be sharing a few different things with you today, including some extracts. But today I'm going to start with a short story. So dreams are obviously a very common feature of Gothic novels, and they're also connected to the creation of Gothic texts, as we know from, for example, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which he writes later, perhaps reimagining, perhaps relating what happened, that it all sort of started with a dream where he saw a gigantic limb in sort of a replica of his own house, Strawberry Hill, I think. And his own house is sort of like he made it, a new Gothic sort of castle. There's also, even more famously, Mary Shelley and the dream which begot Frankenstein. And we are going to be reading a Mary Shelley story about the dream today. Not today, this week. Today we're going to be reading an anonymous story. And it's one of sort of the stories from the slightly later part of that early British Gothic in the 19th century. Now, dreams are connected through those stories of how Gothic novels began in dreams to this idea of imagination, but they're also, within the Gothic, commonly connected to supernatural understandings of the dream. They can act as ways in which humans are communicated with by God or by angels, prophecies occur in them, ghosts appear in them, and also some of them are a little bit demonic. But by the end of that period, you're getting a real mixing of all the different discourses about dreams in the period, theological understandings of the dream, mixed with more scientific, more medicalized attempts to explain the dream. And we're seeing in this story today a text in which these different definitions are clashing and mixing, and it results in a fantastic text. Now, I've talked about fantastic texts before, but just as a reminder, I'm using the Todorovian sense of the word here. And a fantastic text is one that leaves you in a hesitation between supernatural and natural explanations. Now, sometimes a fantastic text might end up not being fantastic, might settle for one of those options. Sometimes it leaves it open. Today, we'll see. We'll see whether that decision is made for us or what you think about it. The tale I'm reading is the anonymously authored The Astrologer's Prediction or the Maniac's Fate. And as you can see, I'm reading it from my Oxford Book of Gothic Tales, edited by Chris Baldick. It's a very good tale. I hope you enjoy it with me. Reginald, sole heir of the illustrious family of de Venoni, was remarkable from his earliest infancy for a wild, enthusiastic disposition. His father, it was currently reported, had died of an hereditary insanity, and his friends, when they marked the wild, mysterious intelligency of his eye and the determined energy of his aspect, would often assert that the dreadful malady still lingered in the veins of young Reginald. Whether such was the case or not, certain it is, that his mode of existence was but ill calculated to eradicate any symptoms of insanity. Left at an early age to the guidance of his mother, who since the death of her husband had lived in the strictest seclusion, he experienced but little variety to divert or enliven his attention. The gloomy chateau in which he resided was situated in Swabia, on the borders of the Black Forest. It was a wild, isolated mansion, built after the fashion of the day in the gloomiest style of Gothic architecture. At a distance rose the ruins of the once celebrated castle of Rudstein, of which at present but a mouldering tower remained, and beyond the landscape was terminated by the deep shades and impenetrable recesses of the Black Forest. Such was the spot in which the youth of Reginald was immured, but his solitude was soon to be relieved by the arrival of an unexpected resident. On the anniversary of his 18th year, an old man, apparently worn down with age and infirmity, took up his abode at the ruined tower of Rudstein. He seldom stirred out during the day, and from a singular circumstance of his perpetually burning a lamp in the tower, the villagers naturally enough concluded that he was an emissary of the devil. This report soon acquired considerable notoriety, and having at last reached the ears of Reginald through the medium of a gossiping gardener, his curiosity was awakened, and he resolved to introduce himself into the presence of the sage and ascertain the motives of his singular seclusion. Impressed with this resolution, he abruptly quitted the chateau of his mother and bent his step towards the ruined tower, which was situated at a trifling distance from his estate. It was a gloomy night, and the spirit of the storm seemed abroad on the wings of the wind. As the clock from the village church struck 12, he gained the ruin, and ascending the time-worn staircase that tottered at each step he took, reached with some labour the apartment of the philosopher. The door was thrown open, and the old man was seated by the grated casement. His appearance was awfully impressive. A long white beard depended from his chin, and his feeble frame with difficulty sustained a horoscope that was directed to the heavens. Books written in unknown characters of Kabbalism were promiscuously strewed around the floor. An alabaster vase engraved with the sign of the zodiac, encircled by mysterious letters, was stationed on the table. The appearance of the astrologer himself was equally impressive. He was habited in a suit of black velvet, fancifully embroidered with gold and belted with a band of silver. His thin locks hung streaming in the wind, and his right hand grasped a wand of ebony. On the entrance of a stranger, he rose from his seat and bent a scrutinizing glance on the anxious countenance of Reginald. "Child of ill-starred fortunes," he exclaimed in a hollow tone, "dost thou come to pry into the secrets of futurity? Avoid me for thy life, or what is dearest still, thine eternal happiness. For I say unto thee, Reginald of Anon, it is better that thou hadst never been born than permitted to seal thy ruin in a spot which in after years shall be the witness of thy fall." The countenance of the astrologer as he uttered these words was singularly terrific, and rung in the ears of Reginald like his death knell. "I am innocent, father," he falteringly replied, "nor will my disposition suffer me to perpetrate the sins you speak of." "Ha," resumed the prophet, "man is indeed innocent, till the express moment of his damnation. But the star of thy destiny already wanes in the heaven, and the fortunes of the proud family of Benoni must decline with it. Look to the west. Yon planet that shines so brightly in the night sky is the star of thy nativity. When next thou shalt behold it, shooting downward like a meteor through the hemisphere, think on the words of the prophet and tremble. A deed of blood will be done, and thou art he that shall perpetrate it." At this instant, the moon peeped forth from the dun clouds that lagged slowly in the firmament, and shed a mild radiance upon the earth. To the west, a single bright star was visible. It was the star of Reginald's nativity. He gazed with eyes fixed in the breathless intensity of expectation, and watched till the passing clouds concealed its radiance from his view. The astrologer, in the meantime, had resumed his station at the window. He raised the horoscope to heaven. His frame seemed trembling with convulsion. Twice he passed his hand across his brow and shuddered as he beheld the aspect of the heavens. "But a few days," he said, "are yet left me on earth, and then shall my spirit know the eternal repose of the grave. The star of my nativity is dim and pale. It will never be bright again, and the aged one will never know comfort more. Away," he continued, motioning Reginald from his sight. "Disturb not the last moments of a dying man. In 3 days return, and under the base of this ruin inter the corpse that you will find mouldering within. Away!" Impressed with a strange awe, Reginald could make no reply. He remained as it were entranced, and after the lapse of a few minutes rushed from the tower and returned in a state of disquietude to the gloomy chateau of his mother. The 3 days had now elapsed, and faithful to his promise, Reginald pursued his route back to the tower. He reached it at nightfall and tremblingly entered the fatal apartment. All within was silent, but his steps returned a hollow echo as he passed. The wind sighed around the ruin, and the raven from the roofless turrets had already commenced his death song. He entered. The astrologer, as before, was seated by the window, apparently in profound abstraction, and the horoscope was placed by his side. Fearful of disturbing his repose, Reginald approached with caution. The old man stirred not. Emboldened by so unexpected a silence, he advanced and looked at the face of the astrologer. It was a corpse he gazed on, the relic of what had once been life. Petrified with horror at the sight, the memory of his former promise escaped him, and he rushed in agony from the apartment. For many days the fever of his mind continued unabated. He frequently became delirious, and in the hour of his lunacy was accustomed to talk of an evil spirit that had visited him in his slumbers. His mother was shocked at such evident symptoms of derangement. She remembered the fate of her husband and implored Reginald, as he valued her affection, to recruit the agitation of his spirits by travel. With some difficulty, he was induced to quit the home of his infancy. The expostulations of the Countess at last prevailed, and he left the Chateau de Venoni for the sunny climes of Italy. Time rolled on, and a constant succession of novelty had produced so beneficial an effect that scarcely any traces remained of the once mysterious and enthusiastic Venoni. Occasionally his mind was disturbed and gloomy, but a perpetual recurrence of amusement diverted the influence of past recollection, and rendered him at least as tranquil as it was in the power of nature to permit. He continued for years abroad, during which time he wrote frequently to his mother, who still continued at the Chateau de Venoni, and at last announced his intention of settling finally at Venice. He had remained but a few months in the city when, at the gay period of the carnival, he was introduced as a foreign nobleman to the beautiful daughter of the Doge. I don't know how to say it, sorry. She was amiable, accomplished, and endowed with every requisite to ensure permanent felicity. Reginald was charmed with her beauty and infatuated with the excelling qualities of her mind. He confessed his attachment and was informed with a blush that his affection was mutual. Nothing therefore remained but application to the Doge, who was instantly addressed on the subject and implored to consummate the felicity of the young couple. The request was attended with success, and the happiness of the lovers was complete. On the day fixed for the wedding, a brilliant assemblage of beauty thronged the ducal palace of St. Mark. All Venice crowded to the festival, and in the presence of the gayest nobleman of Italy, Reginald, Count de Venoni, received the hand of Marsilia, the envied daughter of the Doge. In the evening, a masked festival was given at the palace, but the young couple, anxious to be alone, escaped the scene of revelry and hurried in their gondola to the chateau that was prepared for their reception. It was a fine moonlit night. The mild beams of the planets sparkled on the silver bosom of the Adriatic, and the light tones of music, by distance made more sweet, came wafted on the western gale. 1,000 lamps from the illuminated squares of the city reflected their burnished hues along the wave, and the mellow chaunt of the gondoliers kept time to the gentle splashing of their oars. The hearts of the lovers were full, and the witching spirit of the hour passed with all its loveliness into their souls. On a sudden, a deep groan escaped the overcharged heart of Reginald. He had looked to the western hemisphere, and the stars which at that moment flashed brightly in the horizon reminded him of the awful scene which he had witnessed at the Tower of Rudstein. His eyes sparkled with delirious brilliancy, and had not a shower of tears come opportunely to his relief, the consequence might have been fatal. But the affectionate caress of his young bride succeeded for the present in soothing his agitation, and restoring his mind to its former tranquil temperament. A few months had now elapsed from the period of his marriage, and the heart of Reginald was happy. He loved Marsilia, and was tenderly beloved in return. Nothing therefore remained to complete his felicity but the presence of his mother, the Countess. He wrote accordingly to entreat that she would come and reside with him at Venice, but was informed by her confessor in reply that she was dangerously ill, and requested the immediate attendance of her son. On the receipt of this afflicting intelligence, he hurried with Marsilia to the Chateau de Venoni. The Countess was still alive when he entered, and received him with an affectionate embrace, but the exertion of so unexpected an interview with her son was too great for the agitated spirits of the parent, and she expired in the act of folding him into her arms. From this moment, the mind of Reginald assumed a tone of the most confirmed dejection. He followed his mother to the grave, and was observed to smile with unutterable meaning as he returned home from the funeral. The Chateau de Venoni increased the native depression of his spirits, and the appearance of the ruined tower never failed to imprint a dark frown upon his brow. He would wander for days from his home, and when he returned, the moody expression of his countenance alarmed the affection of his wife. She did all in her power to assuage his anguish, but his melancholy remained unabated. Sometimes, when the fit was on him, he would repulse her with fury, but in his gentler moments would gaze on her as on a sweet vision of vanished happiness. He was one evening wandering with her through the village, when his conversation assumed a more dejected tone than usual. The sun was slowly setting, and their route back to the chateau lay through the churchyard where the ashes of the Countess reposed. Reginald seated himself with Marsilia by the grave, and plucking a few wild flowers from the turf, exclaimed, "Are you not anxious to join my mother, sweet girl? She has gone to the land of the blessed, to the land of love and sunshine. If we are happy in this world, what will be our state of happiness in the next? let us fly to unite our bliss with hers, and the measure of our joy will be full." As he uttered these words, his eye glared with delirium, and his hand seemed searching for a weapon. Marcelia, alarmed at his appearance, hurried him from the spot, and clasping his hand in hers, drew him gently onwards. The sun in the meantime had sunk, and the stars of evening came out in their glory. Brilliant above all shone the fatal western planet, the star of Reginald's nativity. He observed it with horror, and pointed it out to the notice of Marcelia. "The hand of heaven is in it," he mentally exclaimed, "and the proud fortunes of Venoni hastened to a close." At this instant, the ruined tower of Rudstein appeared in sight, with the moon shining full upon it. "It is the place," resumed the maniac, "where a deed of blood must be done, and I am he that must perpetrate it. But fear not, my dear girl," he added in a milder tone, while the tears sprung to his eyes. "Thy Reginald cannot harm thee. He may be wretched, but he shall never be guilty." With these words, he reached the chateau and threw himself on his couch in restless anxiety of mind. Night waned, morning dawned on the upland hills of the scenery, and with it came a renewal of Reginald's disorder. The day was stormy, and in unison with the troubled feeling of his spirit. He had been absent from Marcelia since daybreak, and had given her no promise of return, but as she was seated at twilight near the lattice playing on her harp, a favourite Venetian canzonet, the folding doors flew open, and Reginald made his appearance. His eyes were red, with the deepest, the deadliest madness, and his whole frame seemed unusually convulsed. "'Twas not a dream," he exclaimed. "I have seen her, and she has beckoned us to follow." "Seen her? Seen who?" said Marcelia, alarmed at his frenzy. "My mother," replied the maniac. "Listen while I repeat the horrid narrative. Methought I was wandering in the forest. A sylph of heaven approached and revealed the countenance of my mother. I flew to join her, but was withheld by a sage who pointed to the western star. On a sudden, loud shrieks were heard, and the sylph assumed the guise of a demon. A figure towered to an awful height, and she pointed in scornful derision to thee, yet to thee, Marcelia. With rage she drew thee towards me. I seized, I murdered thee." And hollow groans broke on the night gale. The voice of the fiendish astrologer was heard shouting as from Sir Charnel House, "The destiny is accomplished, and the victim may retire with honour." Then methought the fair front of heaven was obscured, and the thick gouts of clotted, clammy blood showered down in torrents from the blackened clouds of the west. The star shot through the air, and the phantom of my mother again beckoned me to follow. The maniac ceased and rushed in agony from the apartment. Marcelia followed and discovered him leaning in a trance against the wainscot of the library. With gentlest motion, she drew his hand in hers and led him into the open air. They rambled on, heedless of the gathering storm, until they discovered themselves at the base of the tower of Rudstein. Suddenly, the maniac paused. A horrid thought seemed flashing across his brain, as with giant grasp he seized Marcelia in his arms and bore her to the fatal apartment. In vain she shrieked for help. "Dear Reginald, it is Marcelia who speaks. You cannot surely harm her." He heard. He heeded not, nor once stayed his steps till he reached the room of death. On a sudden his countenance lost its wildness, and assumed a more fearful but composed look of determined madness. He advanced to the window and gazed on the stormy face of heaven. Dark clouds flitted across the horizon, and hollow thunder echoed awfully in the distance. To the west, the fatal star was still visible, but shone with sickly lustre. At this instant, a flash of lightning re-illuminated the whole apartment, and threw a broad red glare upon a skeleton that mouldered upon the floor. Reginald observed it with affright, and remembered the unburied astrologer. He advanced to Marcelia and pointed to the rising moon. "A dark cloud is sailing by," he shudderingly exclaimed. "But ere the full orb again shines forth, thou shalt die. I will accompany thee in death, and hand in hand we will pass into the presence of our mother." The poor girl shrieked for pity, but her voice was lost in the angry ravings of the storm. The cloud in the meantime sailed on. It approached. The moon was dimmed, darkened, and finally buried in its gloom. The maniac marked the hour and rushed with a fearful cry towards his victim. With murderous resolution, he grasped her throat, while the helpless hand and half-strangled articulation implored his compassion. After one final struggle, the hollow death rattle announced that life was extinct and that the murderer held a corpse in his arms. An interval of reason now occurred, and on the partial restoration of his mind, Reginald discovered himself the unconscious murderer of Marcelia. Madness, deepest madness, again took possession of his faculties. He laughed. He shouted aloud, with the unearthly yellings of a fiend, and in the raging violence of his delirium, hurled himself headlong from the summit of the tower. In the morning, the bodies of the young couple were discovered and buried in the same tomb. The fatal ruin of Rudstein still exists, but is now commonly avoided as the residence of the spirits of the departed. Day by day it slowly crumbles to earth and affords a shelter for the night raven or the wild beasts of the forest. Superstition has consecrated it to herself, and the tradition of the country has invested it with all the awful appendages of a charnel house. The wanderer who passes at nightfall shudders while he surveys its utter desolation, and exclaims as he journeys on, "Surely this is a spot where guilt may thrive in safety, or bigotry weave a spell to enthrall her misguided votaries." The end of the story. Quite a violent one today. What I've always found quite interesting about that is how it deliberately sets up a medicalized explanation for the dream, particularly through this repetition of calling him the maniac. But it also leaves room for a more supernatural explanation. You have the astrologer's prediction, you have the content of the dream, and both the content and the result of the dream would fit in with the conception of a demonically influenced dream. You can also take that astrologer's prediction as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, of course, as well. But I think what the story definitely tries to do is confront you with different ways of interpreting the dream. And for me, it leaves it fairly closed. But I don't know what you think. I'd be very happy to hear your answers and thoughts in the comments below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. A little bit dark today. I'll try and find something a bit lighter for you tomorrow. Good night, ghouls.